Okay, so this week we're going to talk about cohort studies. So we'll start with what is a cohort. Now, it comes from a Latin term called cohors, which means an enclosure, a company, or a crowd. And ancient Roman military units actually used this to identify their warrior bands. So, in this time, Rome meant 300 to 600 soldiers that were admitted at one time into a unit. And once they were admitted, there were no new soldiers added. So the attrition of these cohorts occurred through death. So as a soldier died, the cohorts got smaller. Now, in epidemiology, a cohort is a group of persons that have a common statistical characteristic, so their age, birth date, race, religion, well, whatever, or a common exposure, like they were exposed to asbestos, for instance. So, what is a cohort study? Well, in epidemiology, we are talking about a type of analytic study that we take on in order to find evidence for or disprove associations between causes and effects. So, we also call these longitudinal studies, incident studies, and follow up studies. Now, a cohort study is one of the two most commonly used types of observational studies. A classic cohort study examines one or more health effects from a single exposure, and subjects are defined in a cohort study according to whether or not they are exposed to whatever the exposure is, and then we follow those people over time to see if they develop any health outcomes, to see what happens to them. So a classic example would be looking at asbestos to see if it is linked to causing mesothelioma, which is a form of lung cancer. And so people who are exposed to asbestos would be followed over time to see how many of them actually develop mesothelioma. And then in a control group, we would look at people who were not exposed and see how many of those develop mesothelioma. Now, a cohort design is non-experimental. It is an observational study design, okay? So what that means by non-experimental is that we do not assign the exposure, and participants also do not have the outcome of interest to begin with. So if we're interested in mesothelioma, none of the participants at the beginning of the study have been diagnosed. Now, we select these individuals based on whether or not they are exposed to an exposure of interest, and we follow them over time to evaluate whether or not they develop the disease. And throughout this time period, we will follow up with them. We will check them, we will run tests, we will ask them questions, things like maybe blood tests or some form of like diagnostic scan like an ultrasound or an MRI, and we will continue to compare the outcomes of the groups that were exposed and unexposed throughout the study period. And the study period can last for as little as a few months to as long as many decades. Now, follow-up of these participants is super important, and when we fail to follow up, or if we lose a lot of people to the study, we introduce bias to these types of studies. Now, these studies are used to look at cumulative incidence and the incidence rate, things we talked about earlier in the semester, and the main strength is that the cohort study is longitudinal in nature. Now, some of the variables in the data will be time varying and some will be time independent. But overall, we can look and see what the time order is from cause to effect, and that allows us to determine causality like we talked about last week. So we use a lot of advanced modeling techniques such as fixed and random effects models to analyze this type of data. Now, cohorts are identified prior to the appearance of a disease in the investigation, and we observe them over a very long period of time in order to determine the frequency of the disease. Now, typically, the study proceeds from cause to effect. So here's how it looks. You can see here's the cohort population. We divide them into exposed and unexposed, and then from the exposed group we look for the diseased and non-diseased individuals. Same thing with the unexposed group. We look at how many people developed the disease and how many people did not. Now, this can work with any type of exposure that we want to look at. We could look at, say, individuals who were present at a nuclear reactor meltdown and were exposed or unexposed to radiation to see how many of them develop radiation sickness. We could stick with the asbestos and mesothelioma condition that we were talking about. So pretty much any disease that has a long latency period we can look at. There are multiple types of populations that we pull from in order to create these cohorts. The first is called an open population or a dynamic population. Now, in this, individuals can come and go freely, and the membership is really based on changeable characteristics. So it could be something like drinking or smoking, having a job, or living in a certain area. So, for example, if we were only interested in studying never married men ages 18 to 25 who lived in Miami, there are multiple conditions that would suggest when that person could leave the cohort. First, if they become older than 25. The minute they turn 26, they're out of the cohort. Second, if they move out of Miami, they are no longer in the cohort. And third, if they become married, they are no longer in the cohort. So that's how that kind of works. So as people meet the criteria, they move into the cohort. As people fail to meet the criteria anymore, they are moved out of the cohorts. The next is a fixed cohort, and this is probably the most common. So this cohort is formed on an unalterable characteristic, and it's also usually defined by an event you can't change. And this could be something like giving birth. A woman has either given birth or not. There is no, oh, I gave birth, but I didn't, kind of thing. Or something like serving in the military, or eating something that was contaminated with salmonella or E. coli, or being exposed to radiation, or being the victim of a mass shooting. These events are fixed. You either experienced them or you did not. This exposure does not change over time. And so we follow them from this predefined starting point, starting with the exposure, and we follow them over time to find out what happens. We usually identify how long we're going to follow them, and it depends on what it is they're exposed to. So for instance, mesothelioma can take many years to form. It could be 10, 20, 30 years after exposure before a person develops mesothelioma. So we would know that we would be following them for a very long time. Now, attrition, which means people leaving the cohort, can happen for several reasons. One of them is loss to follow-up. If you're following a group of people for 10 or 20 years, there may come a day where those people just don't want to be involved anymore. People also could, die, and that means that we've lost them. Or we could just not be able to find them anymore because they moved and we didn't get their address. Whatever the reason attrition happens, once they are lost, they are lost. The last type of cohort is called a closed cohort. This is very similar to a fixed cohort, but it has a very easily defined starting point and a very easily defined ending point, and there is no loss to follow-up. And the reason for that is that it is a very short time period. Now, this is usually the type of cohort that we would put in place for something related to like food poisoning, so salmonella or E. coli, because it's very fast-acting, it clears up very fast, so we would end this pretty quickly. So maybe 2 weeks, 3 weeks. It may even be shorter than that. It doesn't go for a very long time because it's a very fast-acting disease. There are 3 terms that are used to describe the timing of events that describe what a cohort study is. The most common and the default is the prospective. This means we move forward in time with the people. There's also a retrospective cohort, which means we start at the disease and work our way back to look for the exposure. And then there's an ambidirectional, which is very rare and very rarely done, that looks in both directions at the same time. Now, to minimize confusion, these 3 words should only be used to describe a cohort study. So if you ever hear someone say, I did a retrospective study or a prospective study, they are always talking about cohort studies. Now, in a prospective cohort study, participants are grouped on the basis of a past or current exposure and then followed through time to see if they develop the outcome of interest. When the study starts, they do not have the disease of interest. This means we are just watching and waiting to see if it does happen. And these types of studies are very expensive and can be very time consuming. So, for example, if I wanted to see what lead exposure does to the mental acuity in adults, I would enroll very young children who would have been exposed to lead and then test them over the next 30 to 40 years. This type of study, all data is collected prospectively. So we define the population that will be included in the cohort, and then we figure out a way to measure the exposure of interest, and then we classify these people as either exposed or unexposed. And then we follow them through time. And we have a baseline where here's what they were when we started, and then this is what they are at each follow-up. So at each follow-up, we may collect information on other variables that are important to the study. So some of the most common confounding variables in epidemiology are age, race, and gender. You have to control for those things, so they would make note of the age of the participant, the gender and race of the participant at the beginning. And then there may be other variables that we're interested in. If we're looking at a cancer, we may look at blood tests and take blood tests every time and look at those. We may do like a diagnostic scan, like an MRI or an ultrasound. Whatever these variables are, we collect them at each follow-up. We then look at some of the outcomes that could happen and make note of those. And some outcomes only occur once. If a disease does lead to death, we do mark that, and some could occur multiple times. Think about a disease that had like fibromyalgia or another chronic condition that could have flare-ups over time. We would mark those. Okay. At the entry of the cohort, individuals do not have the outcome, as we've said, and we know that the exposure precedes the outcome in time. Now, if the exposure is rare, the cohort study is one of the best ways to study the relationship between the exposure and outcomes. Thinking about asbestos, that is a very rare exposure. Not very many people are exposed to that. So we can look at, okay, were you exposed to this, and look at the diseases that come from it. Now, a retrospective study is the exact opposite of a prospective study. Now, this means that it's initiated after some people have already developed an outcome of interest. So with this, we jump back in time to try and find a cohort of individuals at risk. So we're looking at people who we could find that were exposed to something before they developed the outcome of interest. And their exposure status at that early point would be determined, and we would then determine whether subjects subsequently develop the outcome of interest. So did they develop the outcome of interest after the exposure? These types of cohort studies are particularly useful for evaluating rare or unusual exposures because the investigators can identify the number of exposed subjects. So for example, some of the types of outcomes that might lead to a good retrospective study would be something like looking at the health effects of people exposed to Agent Orange in Vietnam, or looking at certain drug treatments like thalidomide, or looking at other treatments like radiation treatments. These are very efficient for looking at occupational exposures. So this is most often what we use to look at things like asbestos. In this, both the exposure and outcomes have happened. This type of study examines only the prior outcomes, not the future ones. So it's not following people forward. It is looking at, okay, this person was diagnosed, they were exposed to this. Let's see how many other people were exposed and see if they also developed it. Okay. So this usually compares a group who are exposed versus an unexposed group, looking to see if the exposure caused the outcome. So for example, if I wanted to know if serving in the military was related to suicide rates, I would look at people who might have been taking part in the Iraq War. So I might look at people who were enrolled between 2004 and 2009, and then I could follow them over through that period to see if today, are those individuals still here? Did they have any suicide attempts? Did some of them complete their suicide attempts? And I could make comparisons between people serving in a war zone versus those who did not. Now, the difference between a prospective study and a retrospective study at its most basic is that a prospective study looks at individuals and is collecting data from individuals, whereas a retrospective study is collecting data from records because all the outcomes have already occurred and they're already there. So we start with the exposure and the other variables at the baseline and follow up by looking at medical records over time. We analyze these data the same way that we would the people involved in a perspective. The last one, which I said is the most rare, is ambidirectional, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that because it's almost never done, but this has both perspective and retrospective elements. So we might look at exposures and seeing like what the effects are over time with one group of people, while at the same time having looked at medical records to go back and look and see were these people also exposed and pull in a group of that and looking at all their records. And we kind of look both forward and back in time at the same time. These are very time consuming, very expensive. That's why they're not done very often. Now, when we start looking at these types of studies, some of the issues that come up are how do we pick people to be in it? So, cohorts are selected by exposure to a certain cause. And this might make cohort studies a little bit unreliable because we have to understand the differences between the exposed and unexposed groups. So, if we're trying to link smoking with birth defects, there are a lot of factors that might not be addressed easily that can be leading to those birth defects that don't link back to cancer. When we are trying to figure out some of these differences, such as age, race, and sex, like thinking about the idea of smoking, poorer people tend to smoke more than richer people, so you would see a link between class and the birth defect outcome. So when we are looking at cohorts, we try to make the groups as similar as possible, both in their circumstance and in their characteristics. The ideal comparison group is the exact same people in the study if they weren't exposed. So we would have the same number of men and women, they would have the same racial background, same education, and so on. This means we use special matching criteria when selecting the unexposed group. So for every exposed 50-year-old white man in the study, there is an unexposed 50-year-old white man in the study. We try to limit these differences by having a big enough sample size. Now, when we select a cohort and the type of cohort, whether it's open or fixed or closed, it depends on our hypothesis. It depends on the exposure frequency. So remember, like the closed cohort, it's very fast moving and it is over, right? So that would really determine that we would use that over the fixed or open that might have longer time periods involved in the disease outcome appearing. So when we are looking at that, part of what we then decide is whether or not we need to break those down into what we would call a special cohort or a general cohort. Now, a special cohort is a cohort of people who are exposed to rare exposures, so occupational chemicals like asbestos, or a general cohort, which is common exposures. Think about how many women use birth control in the United States. You would not have a hard time getting 5,000 women who use birth control, okay? But think about how many people are exposed to asbestos. You might have a harder time finding 5,000 people exposed to asbestos. So when we're selecting a cohort, we have to go and look at where the exposure happened or is happening. And the reason we have to do that is that it helps us understand how rare the exposure is. So when it's selecting a general cohort, we can really choose from anybody, right? I can find 5,000 people that smoke pretty easily, and we just need to look and see if they have the exposure and then follow them for the outcome, or if we're doing a retrospective, we can see if the outcome and the exposure are there. So selecting this comparison group leads us to something called the counterfactual ideal. This means that if we could put the same person in both the exposed and unexposed group, we would do it. And that's not physically actually possible unless someone has a twin that's not exposed, right? The reality is that I can't be in the exposed group and in the unexposed group simultaneously. So this is where we start matching and where we start pulling people based on characteristics, where we pull, as I mentioned, the 50-year-old white man. There are three sources for comparison groups. There's an internal comparison. So this could be people who worked at the company and were not exposed to asbestos as the counterfactual ideal. There could also be the general population. So thinking about smokers, there are also plenty of non-smokers in the United States. Or we could pull like a comparison cohort, which is from another population. This could be even another country. It could be family members, things like that. When we are looking at a cohort study, it has several strengths. The first is temporality. This means that the exposure always happens before the outcome. And with a cohort study, we can study multiple outcomes from the same exposure. So not only could we look at the effects of mesothelioma coming from asbestos, we could look and see what other diseases asbestos caused. Now, some of the strengths also include that a cohort study is really good for looking at a rare exposure, especially a retrospective cohort. But A cohort may not be the most useful for a rare outcome. Think about a case control design. But if the rare outcome is common in some exposures, we could still possibly do a cohort design. So, for example, melanoma is not a common condition in India. So, if we wanted to look at the incidence of melanoma in India, this wouldn't be efficient. But if there was a chemical that's associated with melanoma, we could potentially follow the individuals exposed to this chemical to see if they develop it in the future. Now, on the downside, there are some severe limitations. First, it's extremely time consuming and very costly. Think about what you have to do to convince people to continue taking part in a study for 10, 20, 30 years. Okay? We also lose people all the time to lost follow-up and other means of attrition. Now, in the retrospective study, the exposure and outcome variables are collected before the study is initiated, which means we can't look for other types of outcomes that they may have had that may not be documented in medical records, because we're only limited to whatever is in medical records. And if you've ever seen medical records, they are not always complete. In the retrospective study, then, the measurements may not be very accurate or according to our requirements, meaning that it may be close to what we're looking for, but it may not be 100% for what we wanted. They're also not good for diseases with long latency. This means that they just sit in you for a very long time before you develop symptoms. And the loss to follow-up introduces bias. Now, you have to follow a lot of people for a long time, which means you need a big sample for this. And so the longer the time period, the bigger the sample. And cohort studies, as I said, are not very efficient for rare outcomes, except in some very, unique conditions. So here are some last pros and cons before we wrap up. First, we can match people, which limits the influence of confounding variables. Second, we can standardize our criteria and outcome. And third, it is much easier to do a cohort study than it is to do a randomized controlled trial or an experimental study. It's also much cheaper than those studies. Now, on the downside, cohorts can be difficult to identify because of confounding variables. There's no way to randomize because we cannot assign the exposure or the outcome to the individuals in the study. And we can't blind or mask people usually, because if you were exposed to something or not. And the outcome of interest can take a very long time to occur.